In this video, we want to graph y equals 3 times the cosine of x. And then we're going to try and determine the domain and the range. Now, when we're graphing the cosine function, first thing we should do is determine the period, amplitude, and if there's been any vertical shift. So if there's been a change to the midline. So what is the amplitude of our function? So we know that the amplitude is just the absolute value of a, so it's the absolute value of 3, which is 3. And the period is equal to 2 pi divided by omega, so 2 pi divided by 1, which is just 2 pi. So our period hasn't changed from our normal cosine function. So what are the key points? So it says label our key points. Now, what do they mean by key points? The key points that we're going to label are x-intercepts, maximum values, and minimum values. Now, where do these key points happen? Well, it's actually kind of nice. All of our key points will always happen at the quarter marks of our period. So to figure out how you should label your axes, what you always want to do is take your period and divide it into quarters. So 2 pi divided by 4, or times 1/4, which simplifies to be pi over 2. So every pi over 2 units, we're going to get either an x-intercept, a maximum, or a minimum value. So let's go through and label our axes, and then we can plot our graph. So here's a 0. This is going to be pi over 2. Add pi over 2, that's 2 pi over 2, or pi units. Add another pi over 2, that's 3 pi over 2. Add another pi over 2 is 4 pi over 2. 4 pi over 2 becomes 2 pi. 5 pi over 2, 6 pi over 2, that's 3 pi. 7 pi over 2. And then we can do that in the negative direction also. So negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, and so on. The vertical axis, so going by ones, so negative 3 and 3 here. So let's go ahead and graph this function. We'll graph it in blue. So the cosine function, if you consider the cosine function, remember that's normally plotting the x coordinates of the unit circle. So when the value of theta is 0, the x is 1, but it's being multiplied by 3, so we're going to start up here. So the cosine function always starts at a maximum value. And then at every quarter mark, it's going to go max and then back to an x-intercept or a 0, and then it's going to alternate to a min, and between every maximum and minimum value, we have x-intercepts. So we're at a maximum, then we go down to an x-intercept or a 0. At pi, we're going to have a minimum. Then we're going to go back up to an x-intercept. Then at 2 pi, we'll have a maximum again. And there's one cycle of our graph. So this is one cycle of this cosine function. So here we have the first cycle of our cosine function. Again, we saw that the period was 2 pi, so the distance from here to here is 2 pi units. But we can continue to graph more cycles of this by just continuing that same pattern. So we're here at a maximum. We can go back to an x-intercept, and then a minimum, and then x-intercept, and then a maximum, and then that's another cycle. So we can sketch this in. Whoops. Sketch this in here. We'll get another cycle here. There's another cycle. And if we really wanted to, we could graph a third cycle. And I'll do that one in the negative direction. So here we're at a maximum. We would go back to an x-intercept, down to a minimum value, back to an x-intercept, and then up to a maximum. So this would be another cycle, but this time in the negative direction. So, and then obviously our graph goes on forever because it has, it's periodic, it's cyclic. which means its domain, right? The domain is going to be all real numbers. And then the range is just from the maximum to our minimum. And so our range is going to be from -3 to 3. The domain is actually, for all sine and cosine functions, is always going to be all real numbers.